Well, welcome to Broadway Buzz. I'm Joe Gary, and fasten your seatbelts. There's going to be a whole lot of shaking going on. You know, the $1 Million Quartet is based on a real event that happened December 4th, 1956, at a small recording studio named Sun Studio in Memphis, Tennessee. A group of young artists gathered together and had a jam session. It was improvised, it was recorded, and it would become one of the greatest landmarks in the history of rock and roll. The producer, named Sam Phillips, was a very savvy man, and he had really invented the four young men who were there. They included Carl Perkins, Johnny Cash, Jerry Lee Lewis, and the king himself, Elvis. They had gathered, and it was meant to be a sort of improvisational jam session, and Sam Phillips, being the smart man that he was, kept the tapes running so that ultimately he had a record of one of the great landmark events in rock and roll. Now, keep in mind, he was also so clever that he called a journalist from the Memphis paper and said, "Why don't you come on down? There's some very interesting things going on in my studio today, and bring a photographer along." And so a photograph was taken that day that becomes one of the iconic photographs in rock and roll history. These four giants sitting around a piano. The next day, the journalist did an article in the Memphis paper that said, "I witnessed a quartet that was worth $1 million, and therefore the term $1 Million Quartet was born." I want to just tell you one ironic little thing about that famous photograph that you see everywhere. You know, it's on the cover of every magazine that has dealt with this period. Books have been written about this event, and we always see that iconic photograph. Elvis brought along a girlfriend that day, and they put her on top of the piano in sort of a cheesecake fashion with her legs crossed, smiling. It was her one chance for fame. She is in the original photograph, but it was cropped for the newspaper, so it only included the four men. So her day in the sun was lost to her. But if you're really interested enough to go back in the archives, you can find her there. As a character, she's represented in the show you'll see tonight. So the show you're seeing then, $1 Million Quartet, is based on a real event. The event lasted over 3 hours. What you see is a 90-minute event that sort of showcases and highlights the experience. It is not a literal adaptation of what happened that day, but it is a glossy, fantastic, delightful, toe-tapping Broadway extravaganza that really pulls you into the world of the birth of rock and roll. Let me, for a minute, before we go on, we go back to this date that I said, December 4th, 1956. Just let me go back to the early 50s for you. As you remember, we were reading Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. We were watching Ozzie and Harriet and Leave It to Beaver on television. We were in sort of a post-war period where America was very conservative and really somewhat naive. Keep in mind the kind of music we liked in the early 50s. We loved to see Eddie Fisher standing in front of a 70-piece orchestra with 6 girls in poodle skirts harmonizing behind him. The most dangerous that the lyrics ever became was there would be some reference to hugging and kissing. Okay, so along came Sam Phillips, and all of this would change. Let me for a moment just go back and go to this term, rock and roll. Cleveland is very proud of the fact that we really invented the phrase rock and roll. Alan Freed, one of our great disc jockeys in the early 1950s, started to create music where he would use black music for a white audience, and he would start to refer to the music as rock and roll. And of course, the term stuck, and Cleveland happily now has the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, really based on that early naming of a new genre that would transform the world. Also at this time, we had another brilliant disc jockey named Bill Randall. And just for a moment, let me tell you a story about Bill Randall. In 1955, he, like Alan Freed, was really into this new sound, this new music that was being called rock and roll. And Bill Randall was called the high priest of teenage taste. And he was about to film a show in Cleveland in 1955 called The Pied Piper of Rock and Roll. And he brought all of the artists that were important at the time, and he brought a young, unknown boy named Elvis Presley, 1955, before his first successes, and he presented him at a high school, the Brooklyn High School, and kids for the first time heard Elvis sing. And of course, it was an extraordinary explosion of ideas. At the time, Elvis and his management came to Bill Randall and said, "We'd really like you to represent me, and are you interested?" Bill Randall thought about it and he said, "I have so much security with my radio station in Cleveland, I better turn you down." Think of that. And so he could have been the Colonel Parker, and who knows where Elvis's career might have gone. Bill Randall was an extremely savvy man. Cleveland is very proud to have him as one of our great disc jockeys and really sort of music historians. And he really was the one who took Elvis out of the South and put him into a world that would explode, of course, for him. Okay, but I just want you to be aware that this phrase rock and roll has a long etymology. It really started with the sea. Ships, for example, would use the phrase rockin' and rollin' all the time. Rocking meaning that the ship would move fore and aft, and rolling meaning that the ship would sway from right to left. And so in all the early sea songs, we have lots of references to rocking and rolling on the high seas. And then also when you look at sort of the black preachers in the late 40s and early 50s, a lot of sermons were built around the idea of rocking and rolling. Gospel became so heated, gospel became so emotional, gospel became so cathartic that the phrase in church was, we were really rocking and rolling. And then again, if you just go back and trace the word in a lot of songs in the 30s and the early 40s and even the early 50s, there are references to rock and roll. But it was really Alan Freed who named that movement that was happening. Keep in mind, we were moving from rhythm and blues, we were moving from gospel, we were moving from blues into this new sound that would be extraordinary. It's so interesting. I went back, and in this period, 1956, when this explosion happened with this music, there were headlines all over America that said, "Temptation will lead to fornication and damnation." Now, what a way to sell music. I mean, obviously, it literally spread all over the world. And isn't it ironic that many of these same preachers and very conservative groups that were very opposed to that music over a half century ago now use it and in their prayer services, etc. So times have certainly changed. Okay, well, let me go back to this event. Now, we have a sense of the birthing of rock and roll. We're dealing with four seminal figures that would really help popularize rock and roll. But let me go back now for a moment and look at that original event as it happened December 4th, 1956. First of all, let me introduce the man, Sam Phillips. Sam Phillips owned this little studio in Memphis, Tennessee. It's still there for you to see, incidentally, if you go to Memphis, but it's really a tiny little space, not any larger than the room we're in right now. And keep in mind, at this point, Nashville was leading the way with country music, and of course, New Orleans was leading the way with jazz. And suddenly Sam Phillips said, but there's a lot of other music out here. At the time, I mean, keep in mind how segregated this period was. The great music of the time was called race music. And race music literally meant that black artists were singing in black clubs, And the whole black community in the South was understanding that there was an explosion happening, but it hadn't crossed over into white America. It would really be Alan Freed in Cleveland who would be one of the firsts to play music that was really meant by black artists for a black audience that was suddenly reaching a white audience. So here is Sam Phillips, who says, "My great dream is to find a white boy who can sing like a black boy." Now, all this sounds, seriously racist right now, but at the point, he was making a very strong statement. He realized that this music was so valuable, was so, altering, that it needed to have a way of going into the mainstream. And so he opened this little Sun studio, and, people would come and, sing, and he started to develop some of their music. And unlike other studios at the time, he was never very concerned about how long it would take to record. I mean, it was his studio, his space, he was the engineer, so all he would do is turn on his tape machine. He always said that he never had a clock in his studio because he never wanted musicians to be frightened by the idea of, we only have 25 minutes to do this take, we can only do it twice, and if it doesn't work, it's not going to be recorded. And so the end result was he had this very relaxed environment. A young skinny boy came in from Tupelo, Mississippi, and he said, "I want to record a song for my mama's birthday," and he did, and it was, of course, Elvis Presley. And he realized when he heard this voice, this unique sound, that this was perhaps the white boy that could sing the great black music. Elvis, of course, grew up attending black services. He had, in his repertoire, enormous numbers of black gospel songs. And so he had a sense of the idiom of the time. And it was Sam Phillips who would record his first 5 major hits. Within a year, Elvis Presley went from being totally unknown to being an international superstar. And ironically, in all the years after, when he recorded in the greatest recording studios in the world, Elvis Presley always said, "It doesn't have Sam Phillips' sound." And what Sam Phillips would do, it was a very early and very primitive device, but he would use 2 recording heads so that when he'd record it through a second recording head, and therefore he could create a kind of echoey effect. And you remember, of course, that one of the greatest qualities about Elvis's music, especially his early music, was this wonderful sense of reverberation. Now, I'm going into all of this now because in the show you see tonight, they catch that sound. They catch that quality that made the original version so unique. So, all right, Sam Phillips then discovered Elvis. Right at the point of this famous day, December 4th, 1956, Elvis already was a rising superstar. And in fact, what happened was he just dropped back in the studio because Sam Phillips had sold his contract to RCA. He sold it to RCA because he had other young, unknown artists like Carl Perkins, like Johnny Cash, like Jerry Lee Lewis, and he wanted to help develop their work, but he didn't have the cash to do it. So he sold Elvis's contract, recording contract, for $35,000. I mean, think of the millions of dollars, the hundreds of millions of dollars his songs have made. But Sam Phillips was really not a fool. He took that money that he got in 1956 and he invested it in a new idea. There was a small, as he called it, motel that was being developed, and he put the $35,000 into the development of this motel. It turned out to be the Holiday Inn. So he made an enormous amount of money one more time, and he was able to take the money then and develop these other talents. And the list goes on and on and on. There are wonderful books about Sun Studio worth pursuing. There's one book here that I have called Good Rockin' Tonight, and it's a wonderful history of Sun Studio and the enormous contribution, everything, from Ike Turner to Elvis. So we have this man who is a kind of genius. He's able to spot young, unknown talent, and he's able to develop them. There's a wonderful story that Elvis told, and again, Elvis's life has been documented so dimensionally. But Elvis said at the very beginning, he was so nervous and so uptight that he never knew what to do with his body. And they were in a recording session one day, and he was so nervous that he was shaking. And Sam Phillips said, "That's great, do more of that." And that, of course, was the birth of the pelvis, when Elvis discovered his pelvis. And the other musicians who played with Elvis at the period, there are all these sort of interviews now, and they said, "Yep, it was very strange. Elvis was acting the fool, and he was just shaking himself around," and we realized that that would work, and that, of course, would become the basis of his success. It wasn't only the sound and it wasn't only the music, it was the physical presentation. Think about the contrast we have now, from those male singers standing in front of an orchestra of 70 musicians with 6 girls in skirts doing harmonies, and then suddenly seeing this testosterone being released with Elvis swinging his pelvis. When he was on the Ed Sullivan show, Ed Sullivan was so shocked by what happened the first time that he promised his audiences that when Elvis returned, he would only be filmed from the waist up. And it was so controversial. Okay, so here we are then. He starts his career, Sam Phillips starts his career by discovering one of the greatest artists of all time. Sam Phillips always said, "He was not my greatest singer. Howlin' Wolf was better." But the end result was he certainly would go on to international fame and bring worldwide attention to Sun Studios. Okay, so on this day that we're looking at then, what was happening, Carl Perkins, who was a rockabilly singer. Rockabilly was that early notion of rock and roll where they used a kind of rock sound, but with sort of what they called hillbilly music, therefore the term rockabilly. And Carl Perkins used very simple arrangements. He used his guitar and the bass. That was it. Carl Perkins was so poor when he started that if he broke his strings on his guitar, he would tie them. And so, you can't move your hand up and down over a string that's been tied. You get, your fingers would bleed. And so he found this very interesting musical phrasing where he would use his fingers, to circumnavigate all of the ties and the breaks in his music, so that he created this incredible guitar sound. And of course, Carl Perkins hit it really big with one of his first songs called Blue Suede Shoes. Of course, what happened was Carl Perkins then would be eclipsed when Elvis would record it, and everyone always thought of Blue Suede Shoes as Elvis's song. So on the day of the event in question, Carl Perkins was literally trying to jumpstart his career, and he came back to the space that discovered him, Sun Records. And Sam Phillips said, "I've got a great idea. We've got to open up your sound. You've got to move out of the rockabilly sound, and we have to give you a bigger sound. So I have a young, unknown pianist named Jerry Lee Lewis who plays a very mean piano, and so we want to sort of beef up your arrangements with this new piano track." So the day in question, Carl Lewis was there with his brother, recording music with the young Jerry Lee Lewis. Johnny Cash came by, who had also been discovered by Sam Phillips. Sam Phillips said to Johnny Cash, "Get away from the gospel music." He said, "Go out and be bad. Go out and sin and write a few songs and come back to me." That was his advice to Johnny Cash. Well, Johnny Cash was just about starting his career, and he was about to sign with another record company. So he was really coming to tell Sam Phillips that he wasn't going to be working with him anymore. So he was there for the day of this recording. And then, just quite by accident, Elvis dropped in with his girlfriend, and what happened, the recording session stopped, and they all just sort of improvised together, and it was the first great rock and roll jam session. And again, as I told you, Sam Phillips, being so savvy, kept the tapes running, and he recorded the entire event. It then was documented, photographed, and it became a landmark event. And the more famous all these people became, of course, then the more they referred to that event as an iconic moment in rock and roll history. Okay, now the show that you're seeing tonight is, while it's based on that historic event, and while it deals with those four people, keep in mind what we ultimately found after all of the tapes were reconstructed of that actual day. Keep in mind there were 4 recordings of Million Dollar Quartet. In the 1980s, there were 3. One in 1980 that was released in Europe, and it was a very short tape that had 17 gospel songs that included the 4 men singing and chatting together. Several years later, they found more footage, and they released another edition of Million Dollar Quartet. In 1990, when they went through the Elvis archives, they found 17 more minutes of music, and they then released Elvis Presley's Million Dollar Quartet. So there were 3 developing recordings to sort of trace that seminal event that happened on that day. And then in 2006, for the 50th anniversary of this great jam session, they found 17 more minutes of music, and what is released is what is now considered the definitive version of Million Dollar Quartet. There's 46 songs with commentary. Now, all of the songs are not complete. Like in any jam session, they might sing a few chords, one person may sing, there may be harmonies, there may be trios, there may be quartets, and it evolved that way. But that recording in 2006 stands as sort of the record of what that day really was over a half century ago. Now, included in that record in 2006, very smartly, they added other songs that were written within a 1.5 year period by these emerging artists, namely Johnny Cash and Jerry Lee Lewis. I mean, he had Great Balls of Fire waiting to be presented, along with Walk the Line and all the great songs that Johnny Cash would develop. So when they released this album in 2006, it had the original event plus songs that became famous within a 1.5 years of the actual event. This would be the basis of the musical that you see tonight. Now, the musical that you see is very savvy and very sophisticated, and in the tradition of Jersey Boys, it tells a story really from 4 different points of view, and it shows you what that day was like. Now, they're not doing an historically accurate reconstruction of the event. It wouldn't really work in the theater. They took some of those great songs that these artists would create within that 1.5 year time period and integrate those songs into the development of this musical. And what they created then is the perfect sort of sequel to Jersey Boys. Keep in mind, in New York, when Jersey Boys happened, people started seeing the show 20 and 30 times, and they were going to their psychiatrist saying, is there something wrong with me? You know, why am I so addicted to the show? I can't stay away from it. And happily, Million Dollar Quartet came along, so that whole audience that loved that show could shift their allegiance and their love to Million Dollar Quartet, and it went on to have a tremendous run. But let me share with you how this show was developed. It started, 2 young book writers decided that it would be a good idea to try and create a musical version, a jukebox musical of this show. You know the term jukebox musical means that you take music that's written for another source, popular singers, etc., and rework them into a Broadway musical format. And everything from Mamma Mia to Jersey Boys has followed in that formula. Probably the earliest jukebox musical happened in 1732 when a show was created called The Beggar's Opera. And The Beggar's Opera used popular music of the day. You know, centuries later, Bertolt Brecht would take that idea and create Threepenny Opera. But really, the first jukebox musical goes all the way back to 1732 and The Beggar's Opera. So in any case, there's this tradition of the jukebox musical. They realized that they could take this popular music and put it into a very slick presentation, using the historic idea that we're in a single location, the recording studio, that we have these four men meeting at various periods of their careers, and we would see what happened, what explosions would happen that would literally transform the whole notion of rock and roll. And so, we know, because we have followed the careers of these giants, we realize that the young Jerry Lee Lewis that we're watching in the musical would go on to be accused of being a bigamist, would marry his 13-year-old cousin, and in defense of this, he said, "I thought she was 15. So, what can I say? In any case, we watched Johnny Cash go through very serious drug addiction, especially with amphetamines. We watched Elvis, self-destruct literally in front of our eyes. We watched Carl Perkins go through alcoholism. But it's so interesting to realize how enduring the gifts have been that these men have left the world of music. I can't help but thinking, and music critics would tie me to the back of their pickup trucks and drag me through town for saying this, but in my mind, what Sam Phillips really did was to create a kind of actor's studio for singers at the Sun Studio. Keep in mind, we know that Actors Studio, with the birth of Marlon Brando and all the great artists that studied in that sort of gritty, earthy, sensual form of acting, that it would transform our notion of acting and theater from the time that the Actors Studio started. And in the same way, while Sam Phillips may never have heard of the Actors Studio, he substantially was doing the same thing. He was taking singers and he was saying to them, it doesn't matter if your pitch is off. It doesn't matter if you're not doing the right modulation. What I want to catch is the improvised quality. I want to look into your soul. And that's, of course, what method acting was doing at the same time. And in the same way that method acting was so concerned with this sensuality, think of Jerry Lee Lewis and, Great Balls of Fire. It's releasing testosterone that's unbelievable. It's not only the piano playing, but the double meaning of the words and the provocative, sensual pressing of sexual ideas in the music. All of this would transform our musical theater. And the days of Ozzie and Harriet and the days of I Love Lucy, were quickly fading. And, the sad days of the singer standing in front of the 70-piece orchestra faded away. And we jumped into this vital and real world of a kind of method singing where it was about emotion and passion and idea. So the show you're seeing tonight encapsulates all of that. It catches a very strong sense of period. It brings back the music that we grew up with, and it gives us an opportunity of seeing what geniuses these men really were. And so now I'm sorry to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that Elvis has left the room. So, but do go on to the theater tonight where you'll see an extraordinary recreation of $1 Million Quartet. Thank you.